My dad was a sex addict to the day he died. I found out he died in 2013, and I found out that he was still sleeping with prostitutes in his 80s.
Life your way. That's mature allure.
Welcome to Mature Allure, Rick. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
First, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay. I'm a therapist. I specialize in a couple things: trauma and addiction, specifically sex addiction, not to be confused with sex therapy. That's different. I work with people who struggle with sex addiction. The certification is called CSAT, and it's Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. And then in terms of trauma, there's this modality or treatment we use called EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And basically, EMDR, when you think of REM sleep, it's a stage of sleep that we go through. During that stage of sleep, your eyes are moving like this back and forth. So in that stage of sleep, what's happening is your brain is processing everything from the day. Take this, don't need that, this goes here. And then people who don't get REM, they're tired the next day. And so this therapist kind of looked at that and thought, what if we take that process and bring it into the counseling room? And instead of things popping up randomly in a dream, we can target them. And so that's kind of the connecting point. So what EMDR does is we use eye movements. There's other things we do like tapping, where people will hold buzzers and they'll buzz left and right on each hand. And that what that does is it activates the brain to get stimulated on both sides. And then we target memories. And usually what happens is the emotional charge that some things have start to come down. That's the desensitization. And then any beliefs that people have about what happened, like I was a bad soldier, I let my friend die, it should have been me, we reprocess the memory, and then that changes. So that's the R for EMDR.
What we're talking about today is porn addiction, sexual compulsivity. If you could explain to us what constitutes porn addiction or sexual compulsivity. What
Yeah.
is that?
Yeah. So, every addiction, whether it's porn, drugs, alcohol, gambling, they all follow a similar pattern. There's a lot of overlap when it comes to addictions. And so to kind of keep it simple, there's two questions we would ask. Like if someone says, am I addicted? Two questions we would ask is, one, does the behavior have negative consequences? That's one question. And the other question is, have you ever tried to stop and failed? And so typically if you answer yes to both, that's an addiction. When it comes to sex addiction, there's 6 questions that we typically will ask. One is, do you often find yourself preoccupied with sexual thoughts? Has some of your sexual behavior hurt someone emotionally? Have you ever tried to stop and fail? Do you ever feel controlled by your sexual desire? And another one is, when you have sex, do you feel depressed afterwards? And so that question is typically sex with self or sex with someone else. In the 6 questions, I didn't give you all of them, but usually if they answer 2 yeses, then we're pretty much dealing with a sex addiction.
Okay. Well, you mentioned earlier a little bit about your training, that you're trained in both EMDR and sex addiction.
Yeah.
Can you give us an overview of both, how they pertain to sex addiction or porn addiction?
In the sex addiction training, it's a task model. And so there's like 30 tasks that you go through. I would say probably most clinicians who get trained in it, they integrate the training into their own style. And so have I. I do the tasks, but I also integrate other things that I feel are really good. And in terms of EMDR, whenever you have an addiction, what we find is that trauma and addiction are very correlated. With porn addiction, you don't necessarily get as much trauma, but you're going to find something. And so EMDR is very helpful in treating the trauma. When it comes to beating a sex addiction or a porn addiction, there are 4 things that will typically get in the way of your success. One is unresolved trauma. So that's usually something we need to do. Not enough structure, still keeping secrets. So like if you're married or in a committed relationship and you're hiding that from this person, that will keep you stuck. And then the 4th thing is, the way we would say it is, not having a good first step. So first step is 12-step language. I like to call it the come to Jesus moment. And that is you have to come to this place where you realize that you have a problem. I can't stop. I need help. And so sometimes when we work with clients and that's not there, that's like, that stands out. And you're like, you haven't arrived at that kind of rock bottom moment. And then really that's what it is. You got to get rock bottom where like, oh my gosh, I have a big problem on my hands and I just can't stop this thing.
So, how did you come to this kind of therapy, sexual addiction therapy?
Yeah. So, uh, I would say it's part of my story. I was born in the 70s and we didn't have the internet back then, but they did have magazines. And when my parents were married, my dad had his porn out. And my mom eventually said, you need to move this out of here. And so he ended up moving to the basement and I would find it. They eventually got divorced and then he moved into an apartment. And when he moved into the apartment, he didn't hide it at all. It was everywhere. It was in his bedroom. It was in the bathroom. Eventually, for those older listeners will know this, Betamax came out and VHS came out. And then he would have those movies and he would leave them in his kitchen cabinet. I would get a bowl, pull a bowl out, and right next to the bowls were all his videos with their labels on them, things that said Debbie Does Dallas and go down the list. Another thing, my dad molested me when I was a kid. And I was probably under 7 years old. It was probably like 7-year age range. And to me, that awakened my sexuality way too early. So, you take the molestation and then the porn and it just, I, a 7-year-old isn't that sexually developed. And so it awakened my sexuality. My dad was a sex addict to the day he died. I found out he died in 2013. And I found out that he was still sleeping with prostitutes in his 80s, which I found kind of crazy. Like, holy cow. And so it's part of my story. I know the struggle. I've seen the struggle. And so that's what gives me the heart and compassion to work with clients who struggle with it too, because I know it firsthand.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask. Did your father ever get any help with it, or it was just something
No,
he?
no, I don't
Because
think.
I'm thinking about when you're talking about the time period. Nowadays, people are more open. There are issues that you can go out there and
Yep. Yeah.
get help for.
Yeah.
70s, that was something we'll move into even now, the shame
Hmm.
that may come with it.
Yeah.
In your experience, because you've worked with a lot of men who struggle with porn and unwanted sexual behaviors, what role does shame play in people?
I mean, like trauma, shame is highly correlated to addiction. For our listeners, let me define shame. Shame, sometimes people get shame and guilt mixed up a little. Guilt is I spilled the coffee. I feel bad that I spilled the coffee. Shame is I am bad because I spilled the coffee. That's the difference. Shame is like it's not necessarily a belief about self because it's so much more. Because if it were just a belief, you could just say, no, you're not worthless and challenge the belief, but that never works. Like, no, I am worthless. Shame, you feel it in your body. Shame, it plays out in your relationships. Shame destroys our ability to distinguish between an observation and a value judgment. So, for example, early in my marriage, my wife would say these mean, cruel things to me. She would say, hey, when you do the laundry, don't forget to separate the whites from the darks. Okay. So, but shame made me hear, I can't believe I married a loser who doesn't know how to do laundry. She wasn't saying that. She was just making an observation. I would say shame destroys our ability to distinguish between a question and a value judgment. So early in our marriage, we had 2 kids and my wife would work part-time. I would work when she was off. And then I would stay home when she was working. And she would come home and she'd say, what did you feed the kids today? And what I heard is, did you feed them something good like a good father would? That was shame. I couldn't hear that she was just asking a question. And then we get into a little argument. And then, eventually I just became more curious. I said, well, what are you trying to ask? And she would just be like, oh, if you fed them pizza for lunch, I don't want to feed them pizza for dinner. And then I'd be like, okay, that's it. But that's what shame does. It messes with our interpretations of things, and we really believe there's something wrong with us. And Brene Brown would say shame at its root is the belief that we're unworthy of love. That's what shame is. So, and shame plays a big role in addiction.
Many people assume that sexual compulsivity is simply about wanting sex too much. But you often talk about deeper emotional roots to it. What are some of the underlying wounds or experiences that can
Yeah.
drive these
Yeah.
behaviors?
So this is what I would definitely want your audience to know. Whenever you get someone coming into your office and they are coming in with an addiction to sexual addiction or unwanted sexual behavior, this person is typically acting out a story in their addiction. And it's the job of the therapist to help unpack that and connect it. Like what is the story they're acting out? And instead of acting out the story, let's start working on the story. Let's start talking about the story. So let me give you a few examples of this. I always like to share two, and I have more if we need to like go into more. This is a story of a therapist. It wasn't my client, but this therapist was working with this client, and this client came in, and his acting out behavior was very specific. But what he would do is he would have to have all these all these components in place. He would masturbate. He would smoke a cigarette, and then he would use the bathroom, number 2. So he would go poop or take a dump, however you wanna say it. And so the therapist started working with this client, and obviously, when you get that, you're like, "What is going on here?" But as the therapist started to get to know the client, what he found out was when this client was a child, he was in a boarding school, and he might get in trouble, and then the teachers would punish him by making him eat his own feces.
Oh,
Right? And so
yeah.
what he was doing was recreating that trauma. We call it
Mhm,
trauma reenactment. So he would take the dump, he would stick something in his mouth, a cigarette, but
mhm,
instead of pain, he was bringing pleasure out of it. He was trying
mm.
to fix it. Now that's a very extreme story. Another story I love to tell is a client that I worked with, and this guy came in and he had gotten in trouble for sending sexual pictures to some girl. So I just started to ask him questions. I was like, "Okay, how did you first get exposed to pornography?" And he said when he was in middle school, some kids told him about a website. So he went home, typed it in, and he said, instantly hooked. He was just like, "What is this world?" And so he said, "But I eventually found something within that world that I gravitated to." So let me say this right here. Everything that a person is into has meaning. It's not random. It's not just, I like boobies or whatever. It has meaning. And so when he said that, I thought, "Oh, what is that?" And so I started asking him about it. He said, I started to like webcams. And in my ignorance, I said, "Oh, you like to watch people having sex live." He's like, "No, no, 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 no guy." Again, meaning, very unique to him. And so I said, What is it about that? What is it about a woman?" And he's like, "I love watching a woman pleasure herself." I said, "Okay." And then he said, but what really turns me on," he's like, "You can be in a chat room and there's all these people in there and she picks you and then you get to tell her what to do." And so as I was hearing this, I just, out of curiosity, I said, "Hey, where in your life have you felt like a burden?" And he looked at me with his eyes all wide and he said, "I've always felt like a burden." I said, "Tell me." And he said, I was adopted. I said, "Okay." And he said, I eventually met my biological mother. And he said, "I found out that she was a drug addict. I found out she was a prostitute." And he's like, I realized that what she did by giving me up for adoption was very loving." He's like, I don't carry that like I used to." He's like, "But, from the drugs that my mother did, it affected me. And I had a lot of stuff growing up, a lot of disabilities, a lot of learning stuff." And he said, "My family would always be taking me to this appointment and going to get this assessment and going to see this specialist." And he said, "It always felt like I was such a burden to them." And so I said, what I think is going on is you're trying to fix that with your addiction. I go, think about it. When you're in that room and you get to tell that girl what to do, is she burdened by you? No, she's pleasured by you. And that feels so good to finally feel like someone is pleasured by who I am and what I do. And I go, you're trying to correct that. And at that point, it looked like his head blew off that,
Mhm,
head exploded. And that's where we did our work. We worked on this feeling of being a burden. That's shame. I'm a burden. And the more we decrease that feeling, that power of feeling like a burden, the less he needed the webcams. Now, I say that like it's so easy. It's not that easy. It's a lot of work, but that's what I want your listeners to know, that usually what we find is sex addiction is connected to our story. And really we're recreating the story in that. And once we figure that out, then we put all the work into the story.
You explained what sex addiction is,
Mhm.
but what are they looking for? And by that, I mean, you might have an idea that someone is addicted to porn. They
Yeah.
might have an idea, but like you said, you have to basically own it and say you are. What should their approach be? If they're listening and they feel like there's a woman, maybe she's living with somebody
Yeah.
who is addicted to porn,
Yeah. Yeah.
how should she really handle that?
Yeah, that's hard because there's a lot of secrets with addiction. I mean, just take one, alcohol, whatever. People will hide alcohol bottles. So, it's hard to tell if they're lying and hiding everything. But I would say to those women, you gotta trust your gut. Like if you feel something is off, trust that. But here's the deal too. With addiction comes a lot of gaslighting. And gaslighting is basically kind of like, let's say it's the wife and she's on the scent, like she's smelling something that doesn't smell right. And typically the guy will throw her off the scent by gaslighting her. You're just being too jealous. Oh, you're so insecure. What? I was hanging out, it was late at work. We had to work on a project. That's a bunch of gaslighting. So what gaslighting does then is it makes a person not trust themselves. It makes a person question their own reality. It makes them think they're going crazy. Am I going crazy? Am I jealous? Is that what's going on? But really, I would say to those women, trust your gut. Trust it. And yeah. And so if it does come out, then you draw some hard lines and some boundaries. You need to get into therapy and you need to work on this. So that's what I would say to those women.
You shared a little bit about your experience, and you mentioned early exposure to pornography shaped your own understanding of sexuality. How can early experiences with porn, secrecy, or even childhood trauma influence someone's relationship with sex later in life?
Yeah, for my story, and I won't say this is for everyone's story, but again, it awakened my sexuality way too soon. Like I remember as a kid just being very sexual, and now I have children of my own, and none of them are thinking about this stuff. I have like a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, and they want to play. And so I know. Looking back at my own story, like, oh man, that was too soon. Back in the day, we might have said if your child gets exposed to this, there's no more ifs. It's when, especially with the advent of this lovely thing here in the smartphone. I mean, it's in our back pocket. And so what we're seeing with the younger generation, it does change your brain. It rewires it. It rewires what it's attracted to. There's this lovely chemical in your brain called dopamine. And what dopamine, it has a lot of functions, but one thing it does is it tells us what is desirable. Like if you eat some dark chocolate, your brain is going to get a little shot of dopamine. It's going to be like, hey, this is really good. It creates a memory of it. So it's like, now you know to go back to dark chocolate. And so think of dark chocolate versus pornography, where you're getting a dump of dopamine. Like, this is so good to watch. And then I used to live in Chicago, and in the winter it would snow, and then the snow would stay on the ground for like months. And then, the side streets, not the main streets would get salted and the snow would melt away. But the side street, they wouldn't. And eventually it would create rails. And you could literally drive down a side street, take your hands off the wheel. And because the rails that were formed in the snow, your car is just going to drive like autopilot. And that's what happens to your brain with porn. That constant exposure, it creates rails. And so, that sounds really sad. Like, my gosh, my brain has been totally rewired. But what we know about the brain is neuroplasticity. The brain is very malleable, and it can unlearn something and learn something new. And that's recovery. And that's why I say it's hard work, because you're basically kind of unlearning a way of sexuality and then learning a new way of sexuality. And so the exposure to porn does affect us. It does rewire our brain in a way. I would add this, but what we're seeing in younger people too is erectile dysfunction. Like, erectile dysfunction isn't supposed to come until like our 60s or 70s. And we're getting guys coming in who are 20 years old who are saying, oh my gosh, I can't get erection. And what's happened is because they've been exposed to porn so much, what they see in porn doesn't show up in the bedroom. And their brain isn't giving them the signal that says this is good. What their brain knows is good is this thing over here, pornography. And it's just not reality. It's not going to show up in the bedroom. And so that's why they're having ED issues.
How do you reprogram that?
Yeah, I mean, one, we would say sobriety. Like you gotta be sober. You have to abstain from this stuff. And then it's just learning new things. I would say attachment. Attachment is how to connect in relationship, how to be intimate in relationship. But really sobriety is a key. Like that is a big thing that we push. Every client from the minute they start with us, the thing is that's immediately on the table is we have to get sober. Like the more you keep looking at porn, we're not giving your brain and your neurotransmitters a break. They're so overworked. And the more sobriety they get, the more the brain learns new ways to relate, learns new ways to find things that are likable and exciting. And again, that's just a like snapshot. There's way more that we would not be able to cover in a 1 hour podcast, but just to give you a snapshot.
Yeah. A lot of women may be listening because they love someone who's struggling with porn or sexual compulsivity. What do partners often misunderstand about the shame, the secrecy, and why these behaviors can be difficult to really even talk about?
Yeah, yeah. So think of it this way. I said earlier, shame and addiction are very correlated. And here's how it plays out. So if you start with a belief of I'm worthless, which came from childhood. They learned something from their brokenness that, oh, I must be worthless. And so you become an adult and you know that about yourself. I'm worthless. Therefore, I can never really get truly close to someone because if I do, they're going to figure out that I'm worthless. And if they figure out I'm worthless, they're probably going to reject me. So I'll never get my needs met. So I'm going to need to get my needs met another way. And that's where the addiction comes in. And so addiction oftentimes starts with shame, a belief about ourselves, and that we can't ever get close to people. So we're not vulnerable. We don't let them know who we are. We might keep them at an emotional arm's length. One piece I would want them to know that. The other piece would be the story. This is connected to this person's story. The other part I would want to say is, when you work with a client and you know this about them, they have shame, they have this story, there's a lot of empathy. You just get to know them. You're like, oh my gosh, you had such a horrible childhood. But the other piece to it too is, yes, these things happen to them. Yes, this is what formed your addiction. But now you're hurting people in your relationship. You're hurting your wife. You're hurting your children. And you have to make them accountable for that. They have to own that. Like, I've been lying to my wife. And I'll say this, I've worked with tons of clients, and what I find more damaging to the relationship is the lying versus the actual addiction. So to those women, I would definitely draw a hard line. Like I would make a rule, like you need to tell me within 24 hours if you have broken your sobriety, like if you have relapsed, like make that a rule and then create rules around it. Like you can send a text message to me. If you share a calendar, put it on the calendar that says relapse, and then I'll see it pop up and I'll know that we're going to have a conversation when we get home. And then, I always say, ladies, if he tells you he relapses, I want you to also have him tell you what's the plan. Okay, I relapse. Here's my plan now. I'm going to do this for the next 5 days. I'm going to do this for the next week to not relapse again. Like, have a plan. And so it's a balance of empathy, but also like, hey, we got to have boundaries here. No more lying to me. I will not tolerate being lied to. Another thing could be like, I want to track you on your phone. I want to know where you are at all times for my own safety. Whenever there's an addiction like this, and a wife finds out, and I use the term wife, and a wife finds out, it's a betrayal, and a betrayal falls under the category of trauma. And so whenever there's trauma, she needs to feel safe. And so you definitely want to implement things that make her feel safe, whether it's tracking him, making sure every device is locked and protected in some way, whether it's a filter or a blocker. And I would say block everything. I would say, ladies, even block your phones. Because what if you leave your phone at the house by accident? You go to the grocery store and he's there. That's going to be a big temptation for him. And so lock your phone too, so he won't even be able to access your phone. So those are the things I typically will tell partners on how to navigate this.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's so interesting hearing all of that. I mean, like you said, with any addiction, there has to be guardrails and boundaries. Maybe you don't want to feel like you're smothering or mothering.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like a
Yeah.
fine line.
I don't think any woman wants to feel like a mother to her. No. No. No.
No, but it could, yeah, you don't want to feel that way, but you
Yeah.
also don't want it to come across that way
Yeah.
either.
With partners, there's a lot of fear, and one fear I see commonly, like they might be upset about something, or he might have done something that bothered them. And she will withhold this because she doesn't want to upset him, because what if he gets upset and acts out? And so, in those examples or instances, we're really trying to help the ladies not do that, because they need to be able to express their pain. Like, that's so important. I like to say that when there's a betrayal like this, there's two really big questions the partner or the wife is asking. And one is, does he want me, or does he want these women online, or this prostitute or whatever? Does he want them, or does he want me? And the other question is, does he really understand how he's hurt me? And that's why it's so important for her to be able to share when she is hurt, when she is upset. And oftentimes they don't, because they're afraid, oh my gosh, I'm trying to not make him relapse by getting him upset. And I would say you can't manage his emotions. You can't do that. You have to be able to express your pain and for him to hear it. That's very important.
Now, on the flip side, for someone who might be listening who feels trapped and keeps wondering, why can't I just stop?
Yeah.
How would you explain what's happening beneath the surface emotionally and psychologically?
Yeah, like when it comes to addiction, oftentimes people that's how they look at it. Can't you just stop? And oh, if it were that easy, Again, addiction, and I like to say specifically sex addiction. If you think of it, it's like a tree, okay? And when you look at a tree, you see the trunk, you see the branches, you see the leaves. To me, that's like the porn. That's the prostitutes. That's the massage parlors. That's very obvious. It's out in the open. We see it. But what's at the root of the tree underground is the story, is the shame, is the inability to connect. Sex addiction is also known as an intimacy disorder. Like, it literally is. They don't know how to be intimate in relationship because of the shame, because of the rewiring of their brain. And so, to just stop, you have to deal with that stuff first. You have to work on those things. And those are, again, underground. We don't see them. They're the hidden things in the background. But once you do, then things start to change in the addiction.
Recovery can feel overwhelming to someone who is in midlife and in the struggle. What does a healthy recovery actually look like beyond simply stopping the behavior?
Yeah. That's a good question. I'll give kind of a general answer and maybe a little specifics. Typically when a person comes in, one thing they're usually wondering is like, how long do I got to do this? Like, how long do I got to be in therapy for? And usually I'm like, that's a horrible question. That's not that's not the question you should be asking. And what I say to them is like, listen, you got to commit to the process. So no matter how long it takes, no matter how hard it is, you got to just commit. Good feelings follow commitment. So that when you commit, then you feel better about it. So that's one thing I would say. Another thing, good recovery involves community. You cannot do this work alone. So we typically will tell a person, you have to find a group of other people who struggle like you, and you got to be part of a group, because you just can't do it alone. And being part of a group, you'll share something, and because they struggle too, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. They can relate to it. I went through a divorce in my 20s, and I remember in my 20s, all my friends were either still married or single, and they would give me their crappy advice about me going through a divorce, and I'm like, you have no idea what you're talking about. And then I joined a divorce recovery group, and everyone was going through it. And I felt such like a brotherhood. I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. And that felt so good. And that's why community is so important. And the other thing I would say is this, if you think of sex addiction, it met needs. Maybe it met the need to feel not worthless. Like, oh, whenever I act out, I feel so wanted, or whatever. It just meets the needs on so many levels. So the question is, if we're going to remove this thing, what's going to take its place? What's going to be the healthy version of you feeling worthy? what's going to be the healthy version of you feeling healthy? Go down the line of all the things a porn addiction can mean. It's like, it's like your thou shalt nots, don't do this, but your thou shalls. What are you going to do instead? So that's a healthy recovery.
There's still a lot of debate around terms like sex addiction, sexual compulsivity, problematic sexual behavior. How do you talk about these labels with clients in a way that reduces the shame, like we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
instead of increasing it?
Yeah, in my world of mental health and addiction, there's different opinions about this. In one respect, you get the camp that doesn't like those labels. Like in the 12-step community, it's like you're an alcoholic, you'll always be an alcoholic. In the sex addiction community, you're a sex addict, you'll always be a sex addict. And in other camps, it's different. In my training, I remember a professor started the class and she said, "Is it easier to say I'm a sinner or an addict?" And we all went around and everyone said it's easier to say I'm a sinner. And we all talked about that. And for me, I was like, saying I'm a sinner, it's like I can't do anything about it. Everyone is, everyone fails, everyone does wrong. But to say I'm an addict, it's almost like saying I can't stop this. I can't beat this. And so in that camp, there's power in that. There's power to admit that I can't do this. I need help. And I'd say that's a very courageous thing to say, to admit that I can't stop this behavior. It's destroying my life and I need help. Like that's so courageous to say that. Let me tell you a story. I met with this therapist to consult and she works with addiction and trauma like me. She works with all sorts of addictions. And she said that she had a client that was an alcoholic. And this client traveled to, I think it was California. And when she was in California, she went to a meeting for AA. And she said this meeting was huge. Like there were probably over 100 people in this meeting. And, in a 12-step meeting, you go around and you introduce yourself. And she said that in the meeting, there was this one person who stood up and said, "Hi, my name is so and so. I'm an alcoholic. I've been sober for one day." And she said, everyone got up and applauded. Like, I love that story. It
Yeah,
makes me emotional
yeah,
because it speaks to how hard this is, how difficult it is to stop. And everyone who is an alcoholic in that room knows that. And to have one day of sobriety is so amazing. Like, way to go. And so, those terms, again, I'm still trying to figure out where do I land. And I need to figure that out where I land. Because I like both arguments. Like, I like the argument of, you're not an addict. That is not who defines you. That you're more than just that. But then I like the power of that word. It's powerful. It's powerful and it's courageous to admit it too. And so, yeah, I'm still figuring that out myself.
yeah, yeah. If someone is listening today who might be struggling with shame about porn, secrecy, or, a compulsive sexual behavior, what's the first step you want them to take towards healing?
Yeah. Again, with addiction, there's so much shame, and to admit it and to come out in the open, it takes immense courage. But I would say to that person, tell someone. I'm not saying jump into therapy. I would say you will eventually need to actually do this work. But tell someone that you trust and that you know who cares about you and might say something difficult to you, but it's going to come out of a place of love. So when you come out of the darkness, so to speak, it takes away some of the power of the shame that it has over you. And so that'd be the first thing to just tell someone. And then you might say, "Hey, can you help me figure out how to get some help? Can you help me?" And I would say, get a therapist who's trained in whatever addiction you're going through. Since this episode is about sex addiction, you would want to find someone who has some knowledge and training in it. I would say it's not absolutely important that they're a CSAT, but that does help. That those letters mean something. But if they don't have the CSAT letters, have they worked with it and do they know it? And there's a lot of therapists who work with this who don't necessarily have the training. They might have a different training. I don't know. But just someone who knows what they're doing. And I would say this about therapy. Therapy is a relationship. And when you get a therapist, you want to make sure you feel a connection. If you don't, then that's not the therapist for you. Not every client is for me, but you want to make sure that like you feel a connection with them. And if you do that, then you got a good therapist because it really is about a relationship. But telling someone is the start. And it's a very courageous step. And so, yeah, that just tell someone.
Well, tell us before we get out of here, tell us about your business. You are the owner of Numa
Yep.
Therapeutic
Yep.
Services in Chicago
Yep.
and in Colorado Springs. Tell
Yep.
us all about Numa
Yeah.
Therapeutic Services.
So Numa, I like to tell it like this. When I was starting out in this field, I was in a private practice and I remember thinking of like, I think I want to open up my own. And my vision was this. I wanted to open up a practice that we saw everything, grief, anxiety, depression, but we would specialize in trauma and sex addiction. And so when I first started out, when we opened our doors, my first therapist who still works with me today, his name's Kerry. I told him that's what I want to do. And he's like, I want to work with sex addiction. So we would get these clients, we would get all these guys who come in. And then after some time, I started to notice that they would talk about their wives, and it sounded like their wives were struggling, like just struggling with this whole thing. And I started to think, man, who's going to help them? And so I thought we need to bring on therapists who have a love and a care for the wives. And they started coming. I would meet these therapists who were interested in a job, and I'd say, hey, we're looking at trying to develop this area, and they're like, I would love to work with them. And so then we started to work with the guy, we started to work with the woman traditionally. And then once they got stable, we'd give them a third therapist to work on their marriage, on the relationship, which is always kind of the final frontier. It's like sobriety, recovery, relationship. Like that's usually what we see. And so now we see both and we wrap around them. And it's really nice because it's all in house. The three therapists, we all work together for this couple. And we see a lot of good work, a lot of success stories. It's been amazing. And we're doing the same thing in Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs is not as big as an agency as Chicago is. Chicago, we're about 32 therapists. We're in Colorado, there's three of us. We're still kind of getting our name out there and growing. But yeah, that's what we've become known for is trauma and sex addiction. There are women that do struggle with this, and I've worked with a handful of them. Sadly, there's way more kind of acceptance, you'd say, around men. I mean, we see this in the churches. We see this where it's like more accepted, and it's not as accepted with the women. There's a lot of women who struggle with porn, and I'm hoping that's changing. And I think that's kind of the main issue is because there's not so much more acceptance and support for them. They struggle with more shame, and so they don't want to share it. And so I would imagine there's way more women out there who struggle with it, but don't typically come in asking for help because it's not like for the men. It's almost like it comes to be expected with the men. But yes, there are women, and I have worked with a handful. There's differences and there's overlaps, but it's very similar. It's a story. They're acting out a story in their behavior. And once you uncover the story, it all makes sense and you connect it all. And so, yeah, to the women out there who are struggling, I'd say the same thing. Just tell someone and then reach out and get some help.
Sounds good. Well, thank you, Rick. I appreciate you being here. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, it's been an honor. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Live life your way. That's mature allure.